Hello and welcome to the 2016 Site Visit Peer Interviewer Training. I am Amanda Bora, Program Manager with All Chicago, and today I'm going to be going through some details for service providers who wish to participate in the site visit process in 2016 as peer interviewers. So just to provide a little bit of context to get started, site visits were incorporated into the HUD CoC competition evaluation process in 2014, mainly as a way to reduce the amount of documentation required to be submitted in the past. And so some of you might remember a time when you had to submit piles of documentation, policies, procedures, etc., with your evaluation instruments, which we found to be burdensome and time-consuming, and so the committee moved away from that and moved towards a more comprehensive site visit to replace it. Now, they were also intended to support a more robust evaluation process by gaining an in-depth view of the day-to-day operations of the project, as well as provide an opportunity for the CoC and All Chicago to provide any needed technical assistance to the project. And so it's really a way to expand on the evaluation and allow for a more flexible process that gives you an opportunity to provide responses that don't necessarily fit into that rigid scoring criteria or question set up in the evaluation paper. Now, the site visit process was developed by the former HUD-McKinney-Vento Committee, or HMV as you might know it, and confirmed by the Evaluation Tools Subcommittee this year in 2016. Now, for this year, 10 low-scoring projects will receive a site visit from the HUD CoC-funded projects. As in the previous year, the site visits for 2016 will have three separate components. The review of the evaluation checklists from the agency and project components from the previous 2015 evaluation process, and this will be reviewed by All Chicago staff. And then you'll also have the chance to have a consumer engagement session with project participants conducted by Lived Experience Commission members. So this was incorporated as well. It used to be a separate project, and now it's sort of incorporated into the site visit process overall. So this consists of a focus group with participants as well as a survey with the current participants in the program. And so the part we'll be focusing on today is the third part, which encompasses a peer interview with agency staff, and that's conducted by representatives of Service Providers Commission or service providers who are otherwise connected with the CoC, such as yourselves. So we'll focus on the details of this component for today's training. In developing the site visit process, this committee and the site visit subcommittee really felt that the process could benefit from having a peer aspect in it. So in keeping with the spirit of the site visit process being a visit of support and not necessarily an audit or a punitive process, having a peer provider would allow the agency to convey their project's operations and performance to someone who has experience with that project type and possibly could understand the challenges it entails. And so the subcommittee that initially created this process felt that the peer provider, in conducting an interview, would be able to provide that peer level support to the agency. They would also be able to bring to the table their program level expertise that All Chicago staff or other members of the continuum would not necessarily be able to provide. And so lastly, they also felt that the provider would be able to better assist in providing certain technical assistance or TA following the visit if they had also been a part of the site visit itself and participated. So what will the provider be doing on the site visit? What will you be doing? The provider will be facilitating discussion and conducting an interview with staff at various levels. And so typically you'll do an interview with a case manager, possibly two, and then you'll also do an interview with a program manager, executive level staff, sort of higher management level staff. So there could be 1 to 2 interviews as part of the process. And the interview basically will allow us to gather more in-depth information about best practices, implementation of policies and procedures, day-to-day operations, etc. So because the checklist review portion will be checking that they have the policies in place, the interview portion is really aimed at determining whether those policies are not only in place, but actually implemented, and to get a better idea of how they're implemented. And so while the documentation review reviews that those are in writing, sort of in place, the interview is sort of meant to expand on that and see if they're actually implemented on a day-to-day basis. Additionally, the peer provider will provide feedback from the provider perspective in a written report that may be different from the feedback that All Chicago might receive or different from the feedback that the LEC members might receive. And so they can use their own expertise to inform the feedback process essentially. If needed, the provider can also, again, assist with TA following the visit. So this could be if the agency had a policy but had challenges implementing it, or some similar situation where a provider may be best to assist in addressing those challenges from that perspective. So just to emphasize some of the benefits we and the committee saw with the peer provider role. One, in having an open interview conversation, it allows for flexibility in responses, like I mentioned, which is typically unable to be achieved by the evaluation itself. And the participants basically come as equals and able to learn from one another. So the project can not only learn from you, but you can also learn from the project as well. And everyone has, to that same end, everyone has an opportunity to share knowledge and to gain knowledge. So this approach hopefully will be able to foster more peer support in the COC and also will allow the visit to feel like less of an audit and more of a support site visit in really creating partnerships and creating peer support. So what are the responsibilities of the provider? Some of the responsibilities we want to talk about today. The first is conflict of interest. So as we know, many providers have relationships with one another, whether it be through subcontracting or other partnerships through the continuum, and these may interfere with the ability to provide an unbiased report. So we'll discuss further the conflict of interest forms in a moment. They also have a responsibility to maintain confidentiality throughout the process. As discussed, the site visit agencies chosen will be kept confidential aside from those who will be attending. And so confidentiality is a major key responsibility of the provider who's participating. Information gained within the interview itself will also need to be kept confidential. If particular client information or anything else comes up, only being able to share what you really need to share with the group following the visit. We also ask that any provider who's volunteering to participate be present, attentive, and engaged in all site visit interviews, meetings, and the finalization of the report and findings. So if you're volunteering to participate, ensure that you're committed to the process and able to participate fully. Some other responsibilities of the provider role in the site visit. First is to avoid comparisons or in-depth advice giving while on site. And so we do have a process set up to provide feedback to the agency and to the group who's participating after the visit. And so we'll really all come together to determine any technical assistance needed. So we typically want you to avoid getting into full in-depth advice while on site, but just sticking to the interview setup as it's outlined. We also want you to avoid reliance on preconceived ideas or perceptions of the project. So as we all know, you might be familiar with projects or agencies as we all work within a continuum, and so you might already have heard certain things or have preconceived ideas of what a project is like. And so we ask that you sort of put that aside as much as you're able to and just create an unbiased environment for the interview. We, of course, want you to maintain any collegial interactions, but refrain from personal interactions with agency staff while on site and conducting the interviews. And we also ask that you just draft your thorough follow-up report of feedback and bring back to the site visit team for discussion. So I've mentioned a few times we'll have kind of a follow-up debrief afterwards, and you'll bring your report and your feedback back to that session. So as mentioned, each provider has a responsibility to disclose any conflict of interest in relation to the work of the committee or to site visits in particular. And so disclosing conflict of interest is outlined in our governance charter as such. If you have a direct relationship or potential for financial benefit with an agency being visited, you should decline to participate in the site visit and ask to be reassigned to a different agency. Other conflict of interest can be previous or current employment, personal association or relationship with individuals employed at the agency. If you are unsure if you have a conflict, or it's best to disclose with the group or with the collaborative applicant or All Chicago to determine whether it is in fact a conflict. We will be collecting conflict of interest forms today to determine who can be matched, but occasionally you may not include a conflict of interest on your form but realize later that you have one. It's then your responsibility just to let us know and to contact us and see if you can still continue to participate. Also mentioned was confidentiality as a major aspect of maintaining your role within the site visit process. It's the responsibility of everyone involved, All Chicago staff, LAC members, and providers to maintain confidentiality. Some of the information you receive may be highly confidential, as the open interview process may allow for various conversation avenues to occur. So in discussion following the visit, other confidential information may come to light through the consumer engagement session or even the checklist review portion of the visit. If you receive or hear any specific client information at any point in the process, this should of course be kept confidential. Information received otherwise can be shared with the group conducting the visit only. If it's not crucial to the feedback or the TA follow-up, specific details can be left out. Ensure you understand the expectation of confidentiality, but also that the persons being interviewed understand what will be shared and with whom. In introducing yourself and your role there, you may want to mention that you've agreed to maintain confidentiality, and also ask that the person being interviewed maintain any agreements they may have entered within their agency or with their clients. You can let them know that you'll be sharing the information from the interview with the others conducting the visit. As such, we'll also be collecting a confidentiality agreement between All Chicago and you, the provider, before you go on any site visit. So what do you need to do before the visit? First, you'll want to, again, review and sign that confidentiality agreement, which we'll provide. You'll also want to review and complete the conflict of interest form with any known conflicts. Then you'll want to work with All Chicago staff and the agency together to schedule the site visit and when you'll actually come out to do the interview. Next, you'll want to review a list of suggested questions to get an idea of what you might want to discuss as you're preparing to go to the interviews. We'll now get into some detail on the actual visit and how facilitating the conversation will go. To begin, here are some general tips for facilitating an interview or discussion. The first is to be prepared. Review the potential questions ahead of time and have some idea of what you'd like to ask. However, don't limit the questions to what you've selected there. See how the conversation goes and use the question provided as a starting point. You might want to begin with introductions and a general overview of what the site process is and what your purpose for being there is. You can go over how the interview will be structured or what they can expect. You also want to sometimes create a space to check in, so let the conversation flow, but allow for times to see how the interviewee is doing in the process. Also be sure to embrace any silence that comes about. If someone needs a moment to think about their response, that's perfectly fine. Utilize further responses when possible. If you're receiving brief, pointed responses or yes and no responses frequently, this can sometimes be okay, but don't necessarily move quickly on to the next question. Use phrases to try and build out a further response from the person being interviewed. Again, the list of potential site visit questions you have is just a start. So you can utilize these to get started, but let the conversation flow as it will. They're divided into different case manager level questions and management level questions, as again, you'll be conducting multiple interviews with different levels of agency staff. The questions fall into some main categories listed here. The first is general. So these are things like, tell me about your project, or how long has this project been HUD funded? What kind of services are offered, etc. The next are evidence-based practice questions. So these will typically look at things like motivational interviewing or other best practices used in the agency. The following are system priorities questions. And so these will typically focus on things like housing first or other continuum focus system priorities. Next is policies and procedures. You might see questions related to things like discharge policies or other policies in place at the agency. And finally, there will be questions related to performance. So for instance, what have been some of the major successes or achievements of the project? What does your project do particularly well, or what do you have challenges in? Once you complete the visit, you will complete the report that we mentioned previously. We've provided a template to record your interview notes and feedback. So you'll simply complete this during the visit while conducting the interviews, and just after, bring it with you to the debrief conversation and provide it to all Chicago staff. You'll fill in one template for each interview, as you may interview again 2 to 3 people. Provide the question being discussed or the topic areas covered, so give a brief description of the question you asked. Even if it leads to other minor questions, give a general description of the overall question you've asked. Then provide a general summary of the response that they gave. No need to include every word or record the entire conversation, but certainly give enough information to give their full response in the report. And then clearly indicate any issues or concerns that come about, especially if it's an area that's recommended for follow-up or technical assistance, so that we can follow up with that during the debrief. So after the site visit, we'll have that debriefing meeting with everyone involved, so that includes the All Chicago staff that did the documentation review, the provider, you, who's doing the interview, and the LEC members who conducted the consumer engagement session. We'll all complete our separate reports and bring them together with our feedback, and so that we can sort of discuss what overlapped, what we all got out of each particular component. And then All Chicago staff will bring all that feedback together into one report and provide that to the agency. That will also include any technical assistance recommendations or areas for follow-up. And then if technical assistance is needed in an area where the peer provider might be able to offer particular expertise, we might contact you to assist with that technical assistance or to see if you can provide any. So with that, you're ready to conduct the interviews for the site visits in 2016 as peer interviewers. So what happens next? Likely, if you're listening to this training, you've already been matched with an agency and you're ready to go once you schedule your interviews and review the questions. If you've not already been matched and you're just gathering information on the site visit process and becoming a peer provider, if you haven't already done so, you'll need to complete the matching survey, which signals your interest to us that you're wanting to participate, and it helps us gather what your expertise areas are so that we can potentially match you to an agency. We also encourage you to have other staff participate as peer provider interviewers for future site visits if you know of anyone else who might be good. If you have at any time any questions regarding your role in the site visit process, don't hesitate to contact All Chicago staff. We'll let you know where to go and be sure to confirm when your visit is to go do interviews and let you know the location and all of those details. But if at any point you have questions about your role as an interviewer or aren't sure what to do, you can certainly reach out to us. And as always, process feedback is welcome at any time. So as this is a fairly new site visit process, we certainly want to hear from you. And if you feel like a portion of this, whether it be the interview portion or another portion of this process could be improved in some way, whether it be scheduling or anything else, feel free to provide that information and we can pass that on to the Evaluation Tools Subcommittee for future processes. Now here are just finally to wrap up some general contacts so that you know who to contact and when. You'll typically know once we email you who you need to contact, but generally if you don't know, just contact that CoCPrograms@allchicago.org address. Otherwise, contact me, Amanda Borda, at allchicago.org, or Elizabeth Perez or Lauren Seeger, also available to answer any questions regarding site visits or your role as a peer interviewer in the process. Thanks so much for joining us.